Let's talk a little bit about the history from the Bible times to the present. Some of this will be review for you, but it's important that if you're going to understand the jumble of treasure that you find when you land, it's going to be helpful for you to kind of get some terms in your head and some dates. The dates are approximate, and it's not like there's going to be a quiz on this, but this is just to kind of help you get oriented, okay? So let's start with the Old Testament time, basically from the beginning to about 400 years before Christ. The first time period that we talk about, we'll call it the beginning, and it basically takes us up from the creation of everything to about 1,500 years before Christ. Now, this particular time period is what we read about in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. So if you think of what goes on in Genesis, this is the time of the beginning. If you're thinking in terms of your high school history classes, we would call this the Stone Age and the early Bronze Age. That gives you any kind of an orientation. Now, lest you think that this is all a bunch of Stone Age men grabbing women by the hair with clubs over their shoulders, this is not the picture that I want you to get. In fact, you've heard of the pyramids? The pyramids in Egypt were built during this time period. In fact, they were built about 2500 BC. So they were there long before the Israelites got there. They're part of this. So there were very advanced cultures at the time, but not Israel. In fact, we really don't meet much of Israel at all until we get to the next time period, which is the patriarchal. Now, we call it patriarchal because it has to do with the patriarchs. And who are the patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we'll throw Joseph in because he's a significant player. And that gives you an idea of what the biblical story is. If Genesis 1 through 11 is the beginning, the patriarchal would deal with Genesis 12 through 50. Genesis 12 is really where we pick up the story of Abraham, and Genesis 50 is where we leave the Israelites there in the land of Egypt. During this time period, we do get to know a little bit more about the land of Canaan. Although when you think of Canaan during this time period, it's not like there's one major civilization. There are a bunch of small nation states that are in Canaan. Egypt isn't quite as powerful as it used to be. It's gone through a bit of a decline during this time period. But this is still the Bronze Age. As we move from the patriarchal to early Israel, around the year 1200, some significant things begin to happen. The one is, relative to the Bible, is that Israel becomes a nation. They become a large people group, thousands and thousands, some estimate millions of Israelites who are in the land of Egypt. The Exodus, the trip to Mount Sinai, the giving of the law. This is the establishment of the Israelites as a nation. Another important feature that happens at this time is that Israel moves from having a law and being a nation to actually having a land. And the land that they occupy is the land that we now know as Israel. It wasn't called Israel in that day, of course. It was called Canaan. And it came to be called Palestine. But Palestine comes from the word for Philistine. Who were the Philistines? Well, the Philistines were a group of people who in this 200-year time period, between 1200 and 1000, toward the earlier part of this time period, left their homeland, probably somewhere in the western Mediterranean, maybe around Greece, left their homeland and traveled to this area. They traveled to Egypt and they fought with the Egyptians. And if you go to Egypt now, you can see large carvings of a sea battle between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples, S-E-A, the Sea Peoples. And this describes the movement of these people that we know as Philistines invading Egypt and creating all kinds of havoc. Well, they also invaded this land that's known as Canaan. They settled on the coast, and they brought with them a technological advance. The time period before we know as the Bronze Age, but here in about 1200 BC, we begin what's known as the Iron Age. And when we're talking about the shift from bronze and copper to iron, we are talking about a significant technological advance. Iron is a lot stronger than bronze. If you're building weapons, it's much better to have a weapon made of iron than a weapon made of bronze or copper. If you're talking about a farming implement, it's much better to have something made of iron than it is made of bronze. So when the Philistines came with their technology, their metallurgy, the ability to make and sharpen iron, they had the technological advantage. They settled on the coast. In fact, if we had time, we could look at 1 Samuel chapter 13, which describes the Israelites during the time of Samuel, the same time period roughly as the judges, who had to take their hoes and their other farm implements made of iron, but they had to take them to the Philistines to get them sharpened. So you can see how closely the Philistines were protecting this technological know-how in order to maintain the superiority. This is why during the time period of the Judges and 1 Samuel, you read so much about the trouble that the Philistines were causing the Israelites. They were a significant threat. They were located out on the coast, but they had a way of making life very miserable for the Israelites during this 200-year period, which is why when David arises, one of the most significant things that David does is demonstrates power over the Philistines. This is what gives him the legitimacy to be the rightful king, because he proves that he has the power to defeat the Philistines. Saul was not able to do that. There were other problems with Saul, but that was one of them. So in this monarchy period, which basically starts at 1000 with David and runs to 586. Now, you know, that's a very specific date. We'll talk about why in a minute. But we're talking about the period of the kings. So this would roughly be 2 Samuel to the end of the book of 2 Kings. You think of what's going on during that time period. Starts with David, and David's son, who? Solomon. And Solomon is most famous for what? The temple, building the temple. Now, we're going to talk about two temples when we talk about the history of Israel. This is the first of the two. Solomon is the one who builds this temple, although it was David's idea, and David provided much of the materials and much of the plans, but God did not allow David to build it. It was Solomon's job. The days of Solomon would probably be the height of Israelite power in the region, because what happens after Solomon dies is Solomon's son, Rehoboam, takes over and makes a fatal failure of judgment, and the kingdom splits. What had been one kingdom with 12 tribes, north and south, now splits into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is made up of the 10 northern tribes. The southern kingdom is made up of the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern kingdom is actually the stronger of the two. Militarily, politically, economically, it's the stronger of the two. But it lacks something that's found in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is known as Israel, so it keeps the name. Southern kingdom comes to be known as Judah. But the capital of Judah is what? Jerusalem. And what's in Jerusalem that every Jew would recognize as significant? The temple. So the southern kingdom, even though it's smaller and weaker, has an advantage, a political advantage, in having the worship place for all the Jews. So what does the northern kingdom do? Well, what would we do as Canadians if the only place we could worship would be the United States? That would divide our loyalties as Canadians. So we would probably establish places of worship north of the border, which is exactly what the nation of Israel did. Those 10 northern tribes created their own sanctuaries. They created one in a southern town of Bethel, and they created another in a northern town of Dan. And those of us who are going on the trip, we're going to be very close to that city of Dan. These 2 shrines, they built idols and maintained that they were worshiping the same God as were being worshiped in the south, but now you didn't have to go down to another country to worship. Well, the prophets were very critical of this strategy. You've created sanctuaries God never told you to create. You've established a priesthood that God never told you to create. And the northern kingdom of Israel got off on the wrong foot, and they never got back on the right foot. Even though they started out politically stronger, militarily stronger, economically stronger, they were always judged harshly by the prophets. And it showed in the fact that they didn't have a king that God established. They established their own king, and they went through a whole succession of dynasties, and eventually they were defeated by the kingdom known as the Assyrians, Assyrians, Assyrians. In the year 722 BC, so you see they lasted about 250 or so years. The Assyrians actually came in and attacked both Judah in the south and Israel in the north, but they were successful against the north, destroyed the kingdom, destroyed the capital of Samaria, and exiled the people. Have you ever heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? This is where the expression comes from. Those 10 tribes were exiled, scattered across the Assyrian world, and never heard from again. They're not in Mexico. They're gone. They were just assimilated by the population. The Assyrians resettled other captured people into the land of Israel to keep the harvest going. And the mixture of the Israelites who were left with the other population came to be known as the Samaritans. So now you only have, as of 722, you only have the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah lasts from that time until the year 586. By this time, there had been a new big kid on the block. The Assyrians were defeated. The Babylonians take over, and the Babylonians are the ones that are ruling and attack Judah, destroy the temple, destroy the city of Jerusalem, and exile the people of Judah. Only the Babylonians do it differently than the Assyrians. The Assyrians just scatter people. Like if you were kicking out a campfire, you just kick the embers out and let it burn out. The Babylonians allowed the Jews who went out into exile to go together in groups. And it was in those groups that the Jews at the time, exiled by the Babylonians, maintained their Judaism. In fact, many people believe that this is where the synagogue idea came, because they don't have a temple anymore, but they still feel they need to worship somehow. And so they find ways of worshiping and establish synagogues even while they're in exile. So the exile takes place in 586. That's the destruction of the temple. That lasts until 400 BC. The Jews are in exile, but then another conquering nation, the Persians, enters the scene. So you've got the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. When the Persians come on the scene, they have a different approach. Instead of exiling people, the Persians decide, we'll let them go home. And so they allow the Jews to return home and reestablish their country. Not as an independent nation, they're a colony of Persia, but they're allowed to go home. And that's the way it goes from 586 to 400 BC. Then we enter what's known as the intertestamental period. Sorry for that name, but just think of Old Testament, New Testament, what comes in between. In the intervening years, it's the intertestamental period. This lasts from about 400 BC until the birth of Christ in 4 BC. So you've got the Persians, you've got the Hellenistic period. Think Greek. Alexander the Great came from the country of Macedonia, Greek-speaking, and he conquered the world from Macedon, northern Greece, all the way over as far as India. Huge empire that he established in a relatively short period of time, including the land of the Jews. This is the time period of the Maccabees. Have you heard of them? The Jews at this time, many of them dispersed to different parts of the world and came to speak Greek. In fact, many of them no longer spoke Hebrew. And so for that reason, the decision was made to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. This happened during that time period. So you go from the Persians to the Greeks, the Hellenists, to the Romans. And the Romans show up on the scene, we'll say around 63 years BC. And the figure there we want to mention, and we'll talk about him many times again, is Herod the Great. Herod was the king that the Romans appointed to be over top of the Jews during that time period. We'll come back to the Romans. We move into the New Testament period. This is more familiar to us. Much of what we'll see in the Galilee region, around the Sea of Galilee, has to do with the ministry of Jesus. We'll also see something of what happens in the book of Acts, at least as it relates to the early part of the book of Acts. But once we move beyond, especially in the epistles of Paul, then it's more Greek and Turkey, and we won't be getting there this time. All right, let me stop there and see if we have questions.